Good evening, everyone. I'm Glenn Moots, a professor here at Northwood, and I'd like to welcome you to Northwood University, and also welcome you on behalf of our sponsors, the Fund for American Studies and the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Most of our guests here are from the Mackinac Center, and we welcome you. Very glad to have you here. This event was actually an event that we started talking about doing BC, before COVID. And it's great to have all of you here, to have all of us here, and kind of like old times. I'm enjoying the nostalgia of thinking about all the events we've had here. And while I've got you here, I want to let you know about a couple more. November 2nd, next week, Tuesday, November 2nd, we have Yaron Brook here. He has a podcast, but is also of the Ayn Rand Institute. And he will be speaking on the subject, Inequality Empowers Individual Responsibility. And that'll be November 2nd. November 11th, we have Johan Norberg here from the Cato Institute. He's also an executive editor at the Free to Choose network, and that's Free to Choose Media. That's November 11th, and that's also same place right here. So same parking. Can't promise the reception that the Mackinac Center so graciously provided, but we will have dessert, and of course there will be dessert tonight after our event as well. With that, let me just encourage you to silence your chirping devices here. I'm going to do the same, and I'm going to turn the event over to Caleb Hortop from the Mackinac Center. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Dr. Moots. I want to give a brief update on things happening at the Mackinac Center first, but first of all, thank you all again for joining us for the first event the Mackinac Center has put on in our hometown since the first wave of lockdowns, if you can believe it. So we saw a lot of you on screens, but it's so good to see faces and to be with you all in person again. So I want to thank you all again for supporting the Mackinac Center and for attending the event, for those that are not yet supporters as well. And because of the support of so many of you in this room, Michigan continues to have a voice for limited government, and the Mackinac Center continues to have serious wins for freedom. Just to recap a few things, we've had nearly a decade of right to work in Michigan, and workers are made aware of their rights to associate or not to associate with a union by increasing numbers every day, largely because of the ongoing work that so many of you make possible. Just 1 year ago this month, the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation was successful in ending Governor Whitmer's unlimited executive authority for an indefinite amount of time, which was, yes. So that's a victory worth celebrating, of course, and an important precedent as well, empowering more decisions and the separation of powers and more decisions in the hands of other policymakers, more than just one policymaker in the state. And as recently as today, we are looking at the future and recent history as well. The Michigan House and the Senate passed an opportunity scholarship legislation package that will likely be vetoed by the governor, unfortunately, but if enacted, would grant long-awaited school choice for Michigan parents and kids around the state. Now, the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation is on that as well, so we're not relying on an unlikely stroke of the pen from the governor, but we do plan to make this a serious issue should she veto an increasingly popular bill. So the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation is representing 5 families in a federal lawsuit to remove Michigan's discriminatory Blaine Amendment. And I know members of our staff would love to talk to you more about that one-on-one if you'd like to hear that, but I know many of you have read the stories of those 5 families, and they represent so many more around our state looking for the right education for their kids. And less than a one-size-fits-all situation for education. So I would like to get to our main program tonight, but wanted to recap some of those things and share some things that are going on. Now, Jorge Galicia is with us tonight, our keynote speaker. He is a Christian, lawyer, and freedom fighter. These are the words that define Jorge's life. Before socialism devastated his country, Jorge lived a life not unlike that of middle-class Americans. But now he is one of 4 million Venezuelans who have fled their country following its economic, social, and political collapse. Living under socialist tyranny, showed Jorge the dangers of letting the state grow. From a very young age, he has been speaking out about the very real damages caused by socialism and has made it his life's mission to win that fight. He was a member of the Students for Liberty Latin America and served as coordinator from 2015 to 2016 and as senior leader from 2016 to 2017. Today, he travels college campuses speaking out and sharing his story. And with that, Jorge, please join us.
It is really hard for people to believe that a country with so much potential could collapse so completely.
Breaking news in our world lead, Venezuela may be on the brink of no return right now.
This is what it's come to in Venezuela. Emergency surgery by flashlight.
A massive shortage of food and aid in the country is leaving thousands of Venezuelans literally fighting for their lives.
Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in the world.
Venezuela's government today ordered schools and businesses closed. Tomorrow, as a nationwide power failure continues, food and gasoline in Venezuela are running out.
People say that what happened in Venezuela could never happen here in America. But I was there. I am an eyewitness. And I want to tell you, think again.
Hundreds of Venezuelans are fleeing the country.
I was forced to leave my life, my family, and my country behind. Now, I want to tell the story.
In the year 2017, I was texting with one of my best friends after arriving from a peaceful demonstration against the Maduro regime. Suddenly he said to me, "Hey man, there is a group of police officers standing right in my front door. What should I do now?" I read this text message and I said to him, "Well, do not open the door, remain quiet and go hiding." But after this, I never received a single text message back from him, just a terrifying silence. My name is Jorge Galicia. I am a 25 years old Venezuelan political activist, and also I am an asylum seeker here in the US. And I'm about to show you a couple of videos of my homeland, one from the year 1970 and the other one from Venezuela nowadays.
Caracas, the swinging city of Venezuela. Good climate, fine buildings, wide highways with plenty on them. All in all, a pretty nice place to be for many reasons.
We have some breaking news in our world lead. Venezuela may be on the brink of no return right now. Violence and bloodshed erupting in the streets as both sides accuse the other of attempting a coup. Self-proclaimed Venezuelan President Juan Guaido is calling for Venezuelan citizens and members of the military to join him in taking control of the country from socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro, who stands accused of holding a sham election and illegally ignoring the National Assembly. I want to warn our viewers, we're about to show some graphic video of the violence that's taking place in the streets of Venezuela today. You can see members of the military who back Maduro literally mowing down protesters in the street today. As CNN was broadcasting those images, the network was taken off the air by the dictatorial Venezuelan government, and at this point has not been put back on in that country. This afternoon.
So, how did we get from the very first video that you just saw in this screen, where Venezuela is basically being shown as a nice place to live in and as a nice place to be young, to the second video where you just saw all of this political violence and where young people just like me and many of you are being hit by a military truck in the middle of the road? How does that happen? Well, today I'm going to try to give an answer to that question, but first of all, I'd like to share with you a little bit of my own personal experience of how it is to live under the Venezuelan dictatorship. I grew up in a middle-class family. We were never rich, but certainly in the past we used to have a pretty decent and happy life. For example, me and my family used to go to restaurants like the one you're seeing on the screen. I used to have the latest versions of my favorite video games, great birthday parties every year when I was a child. It was a pretty good life. But then, and thanks to the collapse of the system, that situation changed almost completely. To the point where, for example, in my house, we don't even have constant water supply anymore. So me and my mom needed to drive to a certain place in Caracas, fill up some big water containers like the ones you're seeing on the screen, and bring those back home in order to do the regular activities that need to be done at home. Electricity constantly failing. In the year 2019, we had this massive blackout that happened in the entire country, and this was like super terrifying because when this happened, it was impossible for me, that I was already here, to communicate with anybody inside Venezuela because, of course, all of the communications were down. And this lasted for about 2 or 3 months. It was something really horrible to see. And even food is really hard to come by in Venezuela. Only 3 years ago, when I was still there, one of my main desires in life was to be able to taste again a piece of pizza or hamburger because, unfortunately, all of those things became luxury to me. Here you can see a picture of myself. I don't know if you're going to notice, but the one on the right is me in the year 2018 when I was still in Venezuela, and the other one was already here in the US. You can see that I gained a little bit of weight. It's not like I'm super fat right now, but but I mean, I think you get the point. I was not eating as much as I wanted to eat when I was in Venezuela. I was never starving, but it was not what I wanted. But do not believe for a second that this whole situation that I'm describing to you, like that this is an isolated case, that it only happened to me and my family. Actually, if you compare my family situation with the rest of the Venezuelan population, you might still believe that we are somehow still privileged among society. And let me give you an example so you can understand why. My grandma, she suffers from high blood pressure problems, and she needs to take a medication on a daily basis in order to control her condition. And thanks God, despite all of the difficulties that we're currently seeing in Venezuela, we have been able to provide the pills that she needs. But this is not the case for the majority of Venezuelans. We're seeing how thousands of us, or of them, well, not me, are dying on a daily basis just because they cannot find whatever pill that they need. Diabetic people dying because they cannot find insulin. It is horrible. And let's not even talk about worse diseases like cancer, for example, because this is how Venezuelan hospitals look nowadays. And keep in mind that this is before COVID-19, so you can have an idea of the kind of impact that the pandemic is having in a place like Venezuela. It's completely devastating. And this is only like one of so many examples that I could show to you today to demonstrate how horrible the situation is. If you read the news about my country, you're going to realize headline after headline how devastated the nation is. And because of all of this devastation, we have already seen how more than 6 million people have already left the country. It says 4, but according to the latest number coming from the United Nations, it is 6. And we're going to places like Colombia, of course, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina. And the sad part about this is that the majority of Venezuelans don't have enough money to afford an air ticket, sometimes not even a bus ticket. So we're seeing how thousands of Venezuelans are just walking through the entire continent just to reach their destinations. And unfortunately, many of them have died because, well, they have faced horrible weather conditions in their way to these nations. But they rather taking these chances than staying at Maduro's Venezuela. But the dangers for me didn't stop there. As I mentioned before, I was a political activist when I was there. In the year 2014, I joined the student movement of my university, and I also joined a political party named Vente Venezuela, which in Spanish stands for Come Venezuela. And this was a classical liberal political party advocating for freedom of speech, economic freedom, freedom of religion. I mean, basically every single value that makes it possible to live in a free and prosperous society. But in Venezuela, in order to do this kind of activities, you need to be a risk taker, and a big one, because the political police is always out there trying to locate opposition leaders that are trying to do something against the Maduro regime. And I'm not even talking about violent leaders like military leaders or stuff like that. I'm talking about peaceful people like YouTubers, people on Twitter, on Instagram, songwriters, singers, people that are just trying to speak up and to share whatever they believe in. For example, this lady right there, her name is Inés González Árraga, and she was sent to prison only because she wrote down a couple of tweets against the dictatorship. Of course, they didn't like what she wrote. This guy right here, his name is Joshua Holt. He is an American citizen who was doing a missionary trip in Venezuela. And he was accused of, because of this, he was accused of being an American spy in Venezuelan soil, and he was sent to prison. And not even judges are free from the repressive hand of the regime. This lady right there, her name is Maria Lourdes Afuni, and she was sent to prison because she wrote down a sentence against the dictatorship, and of course she was accused of being a traitor or something like that, and they sent her to prison. So as you can see, we don't have a lot of divisions between power anymore in Venezuela. And this is exactly what happened to me and my friend, the one I was talking to you about at the beginning of the conversation. After these events, his mother confirmed to me that, well, that he was captured by Maduro's political police. The police broke into his house in the middle of the night without a warrant, without any kind of legality or due process, and they just took him away. And of course, when that happened and when I learned that this was happening, I panicked because I knew for a fact that the next in line in order to be captured was me because, well, he and I were part of the same team. We were doing exactly the same activities and at the same time and location. So I basically needed to disappear really quick. And I was basically sent into a religious place, and of course, I'm not allowed to reveal to you the name of the place, the location of the place, and not even the religion that they follow in this place because I don't want to take any kind of chance of compromising the safety of the people that run this place in Venezuela. But I was in there and I was in total isolation, meaning that I needed to turn off completely my cell phone, shut down all of my social media accounts. I was unable to communicate with anybody outside this place, not even with my mom nor my dad. This was a completely life-changing situation for me because, well, one day I was a student, just like many of you here. I was worrying about my next day exam. I was worrying about my lectures that professors were sending me. And all of a sudden, I saw myself involved in all of this police persecution as if I were some sort of criminal. And of course, I was not. And well, during my time in this place, I was extremely stressed and worried. First of all, because of my friend, because, well, despite the fact that I was not having the best time in my life, because, well, I was outside my house, I was isolated, I knew for a fact that he was taking the worst of the situation because he was actually captured. And while he was there, he was forced to eat food in really bad shape. He was beaten basically on a daily basis. He was forced to share cell room with the worst of the Venezuelan population, meaning rapists, murderers, people that you certainly don't want to be friends with. And while he was going through all of this, I was unable to provide any kind of help for him or his family to get him out of that place because I was also stuck in this other place, right? And I was also feeling kind of guilty because, well, if we were part of the same team, I always thought like, well, maybe he and I should be going through the same. I shouldn't be in a better position than him. And that feeling made me really sad. But I was also worried about myself because I didn't know for how long this hiding situation was going to be in place for me. You know, every single night before going to sleep, I was always thinking things like, will I ever be able to see my mom again? Will I ever be able to resume my ordinary life? Will I be able to finish my law degree in Venezuela? Those kind of thoughts were surrounding my head every single night before going to sleep. It was horrible. But well, thanks God, after 3 months from these events, 3 really long months, it is easy to say, but it actually felt really long, my friend was actually released from prison, and this also allowed me to resume little by little my ordinary life in Venezuela. Honestly, I never got to be the same after this. I started to live with a constant fear of expecting the police to show up at my front door in the middle of the night, just the way it happened to him 3 months earlier. And thanks to this, I decided to just stay away from all of the political activists in Venezuela, not because I stopped believing in what I believe right now, but because I didn't want to compromise the safety of especially my family. You know, my mom, she's like extremely overprotective. She calls me like every 30 minutes. She might be calling me right now. And imagine for someone like her to not be able to know about me for almost 3 months. She almost lost her mind during this period of time. So I really didn't want her to go through the same all over again, so I decided, as I told you, to stay away. And thanks to this decision, I was able to finish my law degree in the next year, 2018. And after that, I applied to participate in this great leadership program named Project Arizona. And well, thanks God, I was elected to be part of it. And this was held at Arizona State University. And well, I think because I was elected, that's the reason I was able to leave Venezuela and come here for the first time. And well, you know, while I was doing this, I was supposed to return to Venezuela on May 1st, 2019. But while I was doing this program, this was also happening in Venezuela. I don't know how many of you have followed the news about this, but basically Juan Guaidó was assuming the legitimate presidency of Venezuela. And because of this, Venezuela went basically into the top of the news. Everybody was talking about Venezuela. And thanks to this, I started to receive a lot of invitations in Phoenix to speak out about what was going on in Venezuela. Students groups at ASU, political groups at Phoenix, people, local media in Arizona, a lot of people who wanted to know more about the situation down there. So because of all of those invitations, I basically resumed my activism once I was here. And well, thanks to that decision, I decided to claim asylum because I know for a fact that if I return to Venezuela under these very same circumstances, I'm going to be thrown out to prison, and I don't really want to go to prison. But anyway, how did it all begin? Did it all start in 1999 when Hugo Chavez was elected to be president of Venezuela? Or maybe we actually have to look even further into the past to understand the actual causes that led Venezuela into all of this political and economic disaster. Because when I was doing this program at ASU, I used to talk a lot with progressive in the room, and I used to say to them things like, hey, I know for a fact that you have the best intentions for this country, but I am convinced that your political ideas might create the very same environment that led Venezuela into all of this economic and political chaos. And every time I said this to them, they used to reply by saying something like, hey, you don't really know what you're talking about. The progressive movement in America is not the same to Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro because we're not advocating for the very same policies followed by them in Venezuela. And the first time I heard this argument, you know, I stopped for a second and I thought to myself, well, you know what? These people actually may have a point because if we're going to be honest about these topics, we have to admit things like, for example, Hugo Chavez came from the military, that he confiscated thousands of private businesses within Venezuela, that he incarcerated many of his political opponents, that he even murdered many of his political opponents, that he created this paramilitary group named Colectivos, which is basically a group of civilians carrying long weapons across the streets and terrorizing society to avoid any kind of political opposition. So in that sense, I do believe that Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez are not necessarily the same to the progressive movement here in America, but let me ask you once again, how did it all start? What did we have even before Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro? Did we have an open economy with a balanced budget, or maybe we had something much more similar to the kind of welfare state that progressives are advocating for here in America? And in order to answer this question, let's locate this talk for a while in the year 1970. Until this decade, actually, Venezuela used to be the biggest, used to have the biggest GDP in the entire Latin American region, used to be at some point the fourth biggest economy in the entire world. We used to have bigger GDP than countries like Spain, like China, like Israel, like Greece. Venezuela was doing pretty well economically during this decade, but in the year 1975, under the leadership of this guy, Carlos Andrés Pérez, two things happened that completely reshaped our history until today. The first of those things was the nationalization of our oil industry. I don't know how many of you know, but Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world. And during this time, we used to be one of the main oil producers of the world. And the second thing that happened was that we saw a huge boom among the oil prices. So the combination of these two factors allowed the government to spend a lot of money, much more money, because they started to receive a lot of new money that they were not really used to receive before. So because of this new money, they decided to pursue a much more egalitarian society, and they decided to create a bunch of new social programs and subsidies to pursue this idea, right? For example, one of the things they did during this time, free college for everybody. The government created this social program designed to grant scholarships to any Venezuelan who wanted to pursue the studies at the university level. The only requirement to receive one of these scholarships was to receive an admission letter from any university, even around the world. Because of this, we saw thousands of Venezuelans going to study to the very best universities of the world, meaning Harvard, Oxford, any other you could possibly think of, for free. None of them was required to pay back to the state a single penny, and it didn't even matter whether they graduated or not. Free healthcare for everybody. The government created more than 20 public hospitals where any Venezuelan, regardless of its social economic condition, could go, and there in these places you would have received free medical attention and treatments. And even the gasoline was being subsidized during this time. Venezuela has always been famous for having the cheapest gasoline rates among the entire world, but this was never because of free market and competition, but because of this huge governmental subsidy. But what happened next? Well, in the year 1978, this huge boom that we saw among the oil prices basically came to an end. And because of this, we saw three major things, three major consequences that, as I told you, reshape our history until today. The first of those things, major levels of inflation for the first time in our modern history. The Bolivar, our national currency, used to be one of the most stable currencies among the world, but this came to an end in the 80s. And the reason for this is because, well, politicians during this time were so committed to the idea of not making any single cut to the existing social programs and subsidies, and even beyond that, many of them were elected under the promise of expanding even more the current social programs and subsidies. And the only way to do this without the huge oil revenue was through printing new money, borrowing more money out of the international market, borrowing more, rising taxes. So thanks to these decisions, Venezuelans started to see major levels of inflation. And what inflation does is, for example, if you go to a restaurant to get a hamburger, you're going to find this hamburger for, let's say, I don't know, 5 bolivares, but if you go to the very same restaurant a week later, you're going to find this hamburger for, let's say, 10 bolivares. And while this is happening, your salary is basically remaining on the very same position. So Venezuelans were becoming poorer and poorer with the pass of the time. And the second thing that happened was that we saw a creation of a culture of dependency. In the year 1989, Venezuelans re-elected him for a second term to be president because, well, many people within Venezuela thought something like, well, if he was the mastermind behind all of these great social programs and subsidies, and if the economy was working really well under his command, maybe if we bring him back again to power, he's going to find a way to, bring back all of those years of prosperity, right? And, well, he won the election again, but surprisingly enough, he came with new ideas to power. He and his team realized that the levels of spending in Venezuela were no longer sustainable. So he decided to pursue some reforms that were actually pointing in the right direction. He tried to eliminate many of the social programs he created during his first administration. He tried to reduce many of the subsidies he created during his first term. But guess what? It was already too late. Venezuelans were already used to the idea of living out of government assistance. And the first day after he announced the reforms, this happened, the Caracazo Revolt, which is basically one of the most violent episodes in our modern history. Thousands of Venezuelans went to the streets like crazy to protest against the government. They started to loot private businesses, to produce all kind of chaos on the streets of Venezuela. And even the police was participating with the looters. So basically the government was forced to send out the military to bring back control, but thanks to the clashes between the population and the military forces, we saw hundreds of Venezuelans losing their life during this day. It was a really tragic episode in our history. And the third thing that happened was the appearance of Hugo Chavez himself. In the year 1994, Hugo Chavez tried to overtake the government by the use of force. He failed, but his attempt gave him a lot of popularity among Venezuelans because, well, basically he was rooting for the very same ideas that were popular among society. He was telling people things like, hey, you are entitled to receive all kinds of subsidies and social programs because, according to him, Venezuela was an endlessly rich country because of these huge amounts of oil. And if he told something like, if you're seeing cuts to your social programs and subsidies, it is only because of the corruption of the political sector and because of the greedy of the capitalistic sector. And, well, a lot of people within Venezuela bought this message. And later, later he received a pardon from another administration. So he never went to trial for the crimes he did during this year, 92, sorry. And this is something I cannot explain how it happened because, well, he tried to overtake a democratically elected government, and he never faced any kind of consequences for doing this. A lot of people died during his attempt. And, well, because of this pardon, he was allowed to compete in the 1998 elections. And, well, he won, but as a president, well, he managed to, as I told you, to confiscate thousands of private businesses within Venezuela. He managed to create this paramilitary group named Colectivos. He rewrote completely the constitution. He changed the flag. He changed the name of the country. And now, after more than 20 years, we have not been able to remove the system that he created that now endures under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So, of course, I would never say that Chavez and Maduro are exactly the same to the progressive movement here in America, but I would really say that if their ideas ever gets to be implemented, well, they might create the very same environment that led Venezuela into the appearance of people like Maduro and Hugo Chavez. It worries me a lot to see how the levels of spending in this country keeps growing and growing and growing, and the debt keeps growing, and the deficit keeps growing, and apparently it doesn't even matter anymore whether Republicans or Democrats control the Congress or the presidency because the machine just keeps going, the spending keeps going, and I do believe that if we don't find a way to put a break into all of this massive spending, we might see ourselves in a really bad economic situation in the future. Will we end up like Venezuela? Well, maybe or maybe not, but we could end up like places like Argentina, like Greece. I mean, history is full of examples of societies that collapsed because they were unable to control their levels of spending on time. So if I were you, I would definitely avoid voting for politicians that offer me free housing, free college tuition, or free whatever, because as you just saw, well, in Venezuela we used to have all of this, but it was never free for us. It costed us billions of dollars and ultimately our own freedom and democracy. And I would even go beyond. I would encourage, because I know I'm talking to a pretty conservative audience, I think we need to remind our leaders that we care about the budget, we care about spending, that we need to control spending, because I think sometimes the Republican Party, they tend to forget that this is important, and we need to remind them why this is important. So anyway, thank you so much for coming today. Oh, I want to, before finishing, I'd like to share with you the story behind this little bracelet that you see right here. Unfortunately, it broke away a couple of months ago, but this was made by my friend during his prison time, and it is all made of plastic bag. It lasted a lot, like from 2017 until a couple of months. But when we were able to meet again, he gave this to me, and this was like this has been the most symbolic gift I have ever received in my life, because this worked as a reminder of my purpose in life, which is no other than to keep fighting for justice and for liberty wherever I am. So, and even if it broke, but I still carry it with me everywhere I go. So thank you so much for coming. I'm open to hear your questions. Feel free to follow me on social media if you like. So thank you so much, and God bless you.
All right, thank you, Jorge. So I will run around with the mic for people who have questions. I'll start you off. So there's frequently debates, and increasingly in the U.S. on the issue of socialism or how we brand that or what it means and that type of thing. But at least by the kind of economic textbook definition of government taking ownership of these industries, you mentioned 4 million Venezuelans fleeing. Nobody's taking rafts from Florida to Cuba. It's always running the other direction. Dr. Tokarev's here. A lot of people have left Eastern Europe heading for land with more freedoms, more limited government. So what is with that history in just the last couple decades and even recently, why does the enduring idea of socialism live on, particularly with younger people?
Well,
raise your hand if you have any questions. Sorry. Go ahead, Jorge.
Yeah. Well, my assumption is that, living under free market is not easy. You have to take responsibility of your own life. You need to plan your own life for the future. And it is always attractive if someone tells to you that, well, I'm going to take out that responsibility from you and I'm going to take care of that. And you're not going to need to worry about your health care or your housing or your college tuition. I think those are pretty tempting statements, and it is easy to believe in those when you don't really know the economics behind it. So I think the best way for us to combat those are, through teaching economics at the early stages of when you are even a kid, I think, because that's how you actually start to understand why these measures are not sustainable in the long run. I think even myself, when I was a teenager in Venezuela, I used to hear all of these ideas, and I thought, well, why not? I'm all for it, free this, free that. But when you start seeing the consequences, and when you know that nothing is free, that everything has a cost, well, that's when you start to worry about this, and you start to care about spending and saving money for the future, right?
In order to capture the imagination of people in a revolution, you have to have bad guys, right? And you said a little bit about this. Could you speak more during that economic revolution and the change under Chavez and Maduro? Who were the bad guys? Who were the people taught to hate and despise as being the enemies of Venezuela in their own country?
Well, I would say, first of all, of course, the rich people. Venezuelan rich people. Hugo Chavez was always telling the Venezuelans that all of these rich people are taking advantage from you. They are stealing your money. They are stealing your opportunities. And, well, a lot of people within Venezuela bought this message. And, of course, there was the foreign enemy, for sure. That was, of course, the United States of America for Hugo Chavez, the empire, the evil empire. And, well, he managed to, because of this rhetoric, he expelled a lot of American industries that were doing really great job within Venezuela. And this wasn't even brought by Hugo Chavez. This anti-American sentiment was alive well before him. Actually, this was one of the reasons why the oil industry was nationalized, because it used to be run by American industries. And, people within Venezuela felt like they were being taken advantage of. But, well, the result after we expelled them was not the best. So, yeah.
So you've told your story, and there's been countless other countries that have failed under the lack of private property and socialism. So how do you think that we can use the history of those other countries to learn about how we should run government and how we should change our country?
Well, I think people need to learn about all of this experience, not only Venezuela. We have Cuba, we have the Soviet Union, we have China, we have a lot of different places that collapsed because of following these Marxist and collectivist ideas. And the fact that this debate is still alive today after all of these failed attempts is kind of sad, because how many more failed attempts do we need to get people to realize that these ideas do not work, right? But we need to keep teaching about this. We need to hear about people who escape from all of these places. I mean, not only me, that we have a huge Venezuelan community in South Florida, for example, that are more than willing to share our story. People coming from China, from Hong Kong. I mean, a lot of witnesses that know how these ideas actually work, and they are not what they sound like, right?
My question is about oil prices and what effect this might have had on the developments in Venezuela. And I have heard, there was an oil crash that would have affected Venezuela's finances severely, and to what extent was that responsible for the economic conditions in the country?
Well, of course, that had an impact. But for example, Norway, which is a big oil producer, and its economy depends a lot of oil, you don't see this kind of devastation after the oil prices break down because, well, Norway, for example, produces a lot of different things because they allow the market to flourish, right? But when you go out there and crack down on private businesses of all kinds, and when you basically tell people to stop producing anything, and when the only thing is keeping you alive is oil, of course, when prices goes down, it is not easy. It is easy to imagine why the country collapsed so quickly. But we should never have been so dependent on oil in the first place. But we ended up being so dependent because of these horrible policy decisions made by Hugo Chavez. But that all of these fight that he got into against all of these private businesses that were doing a really good job. So yeah, of course, the downfall on the oil prices helped, but this was never the main cause of all of this economic collapse. You're not seeing this anywhere. In Saudi Arabia, for example, you don't see this kind of starvation and devastation going on right now, even though they depend a lot of oil as well.
You have experienced Venezuela. You are experiencing the United States. Where in your mind is the United States heading?
Well, right now, I am extremely concerned, as I mentioned. I think my main concern right now are the levels of spending. I see a lot of similarities there between Venezuela and America. I think both countries, America right now is failing horribly to control the levels of spending. We are seeing what, 5% levels of inflation. And of course, it's not even near enough to whatever we're having in Venezuela. But if we keep going this path, well, we're going to end up in a really bad economic situation. And as I told you, I don't think this isn't even a problem of I don't know, Joe Biden or whoever is running Congress and the presidency, because we saw how Congress and presidency keeps flipping between parties and the spending just keeps growing. I mean, this is not a single party problem. This is the whole political. I think the whole political spectrum is somehow contributing to this scenario, and we need to find a way to put a brake on this. I hope we don't need to reach the consequences of, being like Venezuela or like Argentina to realize that, well, we cannot keep expanding like if there was not tomorrow.
When you were in Venezuela in the university, just a comment first. I mean, I've spoken with a couple of university professors, not from Northwood, by the way, but this one professor explained to me, he says, communism will work, it's just that you got to know how to work it. So my question is, in the university, when you were in university in Venezuela, what were your instructors telling you then?
Well, actually, I had the privilege to attend to a private university in Venezuela, and basically, I would assume that's the reason why I ended up in the classical liberal field. I mean, my professors were really great, teaching me about the benefits of free market and the benefit of protected private property. And thanks to all of that lessons that I learned from a lot of professors, really great professors within my university, and also great think tanks working within Venezuela, classical liberal think tanks, plus that I was already seeing all of the experience, how even my own family was suffering from all of these decisions, how I saw, for example, that Hugo Chavez confiscated the industry that used to supply water for the houses. He confiscated that, and then a year later from that, we stopped having water supply in our house. I mean, it was pretty easy with all of these instructions to to realize what was going on and why everything was so bad in Venezuela. But yeah, thank God I attended to this private university that has been actually under several attacks from the regime because they know that they don't control what is being taught there. And yeah, that's the contrast that I had. I mean, the regime does not have control of these places that still exist in Venezuela. So my experience within the university was great, thanks God.
Thank you. I have a question about the long-term effects of the socialist government on Venezuela and like if they've been having progress towards like more free markets, and then if we as Americans can learn or apply any of their progress towards like more freedoms or less of the restrictions. Like, can we help our government to see how we can do better, I guess, by using the Venezuelan model?
Like, can you rephrase your question? Like,
sure. Is Venezuela making progress towards more free markets? Like, do they have a better government now? Their elected officials, are their citizens, have they learned now that socialism is not working?
Yeah, we don't have another government. we have the same socialist government, unfortunately. Of course, Hugo Chavez died in 2013, but his successor is still in place, and they are doing pretty much the same. However, there is something really interesting going on right now in Venezuela, and this is because of U.S. sanctions. You know, U.S. sanctions has avoided the regime to have, I mean, they have worked in the fact that the regime has less money from whatever they had a couple of years ago, right? And the regime in Venezuela, of course, wants to have more money to keep the regime going. And because they want more money, they have decided to stay a little bit away from all of this orthodoxy, Marxist orthodoxy that they used to follow. And now, for example, they allow people to import whatever product they need from abroad. They are allowing people to use the US dollar instead of the Bolivar, that's our national currency, which is completely devastated. They are actually trying to create a little bit of confidence among investors from all around the world to try to bring them back to Venezuela and to relocate their investments. I mean, they are trying to turn the wheel a little bit from all of this Marxist experiment to sell the idea that Venezuela is open for business, which of course I don't believe any of that, because you cannot trust these people. I mean, these people say one thing today and the other day they're going to do the exact opposite. I don't think anybody can trust whatever they are saying, but because of sanctions, they are trying to change their their policies, and I think it's going a little bit towards free market, but this is not actually free market. I mean, Venezuela is changing, but yeah, I don't know if that's answered your question.
So it seems to me like a lot of these problems stem from laziness and people's unwillingness to work for what they earn. In a world where it gets easier and easier, especially in America, to not work, how do you go to someone and tell them what they're doing is wrong and convince them to go the other way? How do you do that when laziness is the easy alternative?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it is extremely hard. You know, when the opposition was facing Hugo Chavez during election years, you know, there was never this debate where the opposition started telling people like, hey, this is not really the way, we need to get rid of all of this government assistance and bureaucracy. The opposition was telling people things like, hey, if Hugo Chavez give you this, we're going to give you the double. So that was the debate in Venezuela for many years. It wasn't until, you know, the devastation was in front of us that people started talking about, well, free markets and stuff. So, and right now, the very word socialism is a really unpopular word. Actually, many of these political parties within the opposition, they claim to be socialists, and they were aligned with the international socialists. They work with them. But now, because the word socialism is so unpopular within Venezuela, they are trying to withdraw their affiliations from all of these socialist organizations, and Now that we're facing the consequences, it's easier for us to explain why this is not the way and we should pursue another path. But yeah, it is extremely hard. Once you have the token, once you have the incentive, it is really hard to convince people that, well, this is not the way, we should do something different. And that's why, I'm so scared right now about all of these relief programs created by COVID that doesn't seem to be, disappearing anytime soon, even though I think the pandemic is pretty much, well, I don't know, I'm not going to say gone, but we should start working again, right? I mean, a country cannot live on government assistance forever because, well.
To expand a little bit on that question, the U.S. literally watched the developments of Venezuela on the news, regardless of party. If that doesn't drive attention to this topic and where we're headed and how this aggregated, how do we drive that idea to society that this is the future?
Well, my bet is by doing activities like this, promoting events that educate people about the dangers of collectivism and socialism. I think I love the work that people like the Mackinac Center does, or the Fund for American Studies does. In Venezuela, we never had, a lot of, actually, I only recall one think tank, that's the one I was talking about, that was doing this kind of job, but it was never enough. So the fact that I see a lot of different organizations within America that are trying to educate people about liberty and why liberty is the best option for all of us, I think that gives me hope, at least, right, that the work is being done somehow. But in Venezuela, we really never had something like that in this level. So yeah, I think through education, that's our best bet.
4 million Venezuelans have voted with their feet by leaving the country. Of the people who are still in Venezuela, are they actively resisting the dictatorship?
Well, I mean, of course we speak sometimes, but I don't think we have like a big political force conformed by exiled people, unfortunately, because that would be a great thing to see. The thing is that all of these people that have left are like so poor that they go to this country just to work and start their life going again. So I don't think we cannot expect like a big political leadership coming out from them right away. But I would say that a lot of these countries that have received us, the left, the political left in these countries are starting to attack a lot the Venezuelan people that are arriving, because we basically, majority of us arrive with the message that that socialism is not the way. So whenever we see someone who is having the same rhetoric used by Hugo Chavez, for example, it is easy for us to say, hey, don't follow this guy. He's doing a terrible, he's gonna lead your country just like Hugo Chavez led Venezuela. So we have had all these kind of problems. I mean, we are seeing a lot of xenophobic attacks from the left, like for example in Chile or in Colombia. I mean, all of these leftist political groups hate our diaspora because they know that we are not going to be, in favor of their political agenda. And that actually, we saw kind of the same thing in South Florida, where we have a big Venezuelan community. During the last presidential cycle, well, many of them turned out voting for, for conservative principles, because of course we fear that socialism, all of might come to the U.S. So this was the first presidential cycle that we saw Venezuelans voting for more conservative ideas, I think. So,
the civilian population in the U.S. is armed to the teeth. Is that the same in Venezuela?
Well, we have. You mean armed, like guns? Yeah. No, I don't. Hugo Chavez in 2012, he did a big push against. He was rooting for gun control, and he did a big effort to try to confiscate guns from average Venezuelans. Of course, we never had like a big gun culture like the one you have here, but you could say that, of course, Venezuela is one of the most dangerous places in the entire world. This is because, of course, guns are in the hands of only criminals, and pretty much Venezuelans don't have the way to defend themselves against these kind of things. And I think that's actually the reason, the main reason why the socialist regime has been able to exist for this long period of time, because Venezuelans are not armed, and we cannot defend themselves against this dictatorship. And I think this illustrates exactly right why it is important to defend the Second Amendment here in America, to avoid the rise of any kind of authoritarian or totalitarian leader here in the States, right?
Time for about 2 more questions, and I think they're allotted for.
So I think there's, broadly 2 big arguments against socialism. I think sometimes people hear the 2 arguments without quite realizing they're 2 different arguments. So like if you think, for example, like Orwell's Animal Farmer in 1984, it's like horrible people come to power, like the pigs abuse the power for their own benefit, or Big Brother for his own benefit. And on the other hand, you have someone like Ludwig von Mises says, let's assume the socialist government is perfectly well-intentioned, perfectly altruistic, nothing but the good of the people. The logic of the programs, a program will fail, so then they'll have to do something else to fix the problems. That will fail, and by the own logic of the system, they get mired deeper and deeper in a more and more failing system, and then eventually they even have to start doing things like closing borders or shooting dissenters just to repair their own broken system, but they never had the intention of that. To what extent do you think one argument or the other, or both, may or may not have played a role in Venezuela, and what Americans should be concerned about?
Well, of course, I don't have the exact answer, but in my own personal opinion, I do believe that Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they never really had any good intention for Venezuela. They always saw in these socialist policies a way to control us. I mean, all of this devastation, all of this poorness that we're seeing right now in the country, this didn't happen because of mismanagement or because of, they didn't know what they're doing. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it because they know that if you create poverty among society, it is extremely easy for the regime to control society. For example, after the year 2014, when we started to see all of these big lines to get a piece of bread, all of this devastation, all of this scarcity, they created this system that the regime was basically forcing people to join the ruling party and get a membership ID in order to get access to whatever little food was left, whatever little medicine was left. So that's when you start to see that these people never got any kind of good intention. They only wanted to make us poor to have more control over our lives, and that's what ended up happening. So, yeah, I don't see them as people who had good intentions. I don't believe that.
All right, we got our last question, but I know Jorge will hang around for a little bit afterwards, and you can ask things to him personally.
So in countries like China, the history of collectivism and the tragedies are not talked about in the schools. In a country like Venezuela, how is the public school instilled the values of collectivism in the young minds?
Can you rephrase your question to see if I got it right? Sorry.
How does the schools in Venezuela teach collectivism?
Yeah. The public schools in Venezuela are like horrible. You enter a classroom and you're gonna find a picture of Hugo Chavez, a big picture of Hugo Chavez, and they are basically teaching kids that this is our leader. They even sometimes compare him with Jesus Christ, for example. Or it is horrible what's going on right now in public schools in Venezuela, and that's my biggest fear right now. Because even though if we manage to somehow remove the regime, let's say tomorrow, what's going to happen with that generation that grow up, that never knew anything different than this regime? Because at least I had the privilege of attending private schools. You don't see this in private schools in Venezuela, but public schools where majority of students attend, they were being taught horrible things, like lies all over. And so, yeah, I don't know how are we going to be able to fix that in the future? But I hope we can find a way.
Not the most hopeful note, but let's give Jorge a hand.
Thank you, David.
All right, so if your question was not answered, we are out of time for our time here in the auditorium, but Jorge will be available out in the reception area again, so you're welcome to chat amongst yourselves and meet him in person, ask your question. I do want to thank all of you again for joining us tonight. It's great to interact with so many people who care about advancing freedom and limiting government. We do have a couple of events on the docket, one in Royal Oak at the Imagine Theater on the Climate Hustle 2. That's a movie showing, so I know that's a little bit of a drive, but that's information's on our website, and if you're on our mailing list, that's been sent to you. And there's another on the emergency powers and pandemic mismanagement, which will take place at the Freedom Hall, where the Mackinac Center shares a space in Lansing. That's also coming up. Both of those are in mid-November, so be on the lookout for those. And again, thank you again for the thoughtful question and answer session. And for all you do, there are a few cookies available and some coffee. So I think the wine and the beer are closed up, but feel free to get some coffee before we hit the road. And thank you again.